The courtyard of the Red Keep was buzzing with the hum of anticipation, a steady murmur that lapped against the ancient stone walls like the ocean against a rocky shore. When Margaery Tyrell arrived in King's Landing this time, she did so with a regal poise and an entourage that outshone even the Lannisters in its lavish display of gold-threaded silks and bright blooming roses. Under the early afternoon sun, all eyes seemed to tilt her way, and she allowed them. This was, after all, exactly the effect the Tyrells wanted to achieve. A statement of wealth, beauty, and power that no courtier could ignore. The timing of her arrival, however, was unusual. Word had spread. Everyone knew it was happening sooner than originally planned. The delicate negotiations, the quiet and sometimes not-so-quiet frustrations between Mace Tyrell and Tywin Lannister had led to an acceleration of the wedding date. Joffrey Baratheon and Margaery Tyrell would be wed by the month's end, not long after Renly Baratheon's sudden demise. Many wondered what it meant, that the Tyrells had so quickly repositioned themselves after backing Renly in his claim. Others whispered that Lady Olenna Tyrell's cunning had guided the family's pivot toward King's Landing, placing Margaery in the heart of the Seven Kingdoms' power more swiftly than anyone expected. Margaery dismounted carefully, letting a stable boy take the reins of her palfrey. She wore a gown of pale ivory, overlaid with gold filigree in the shape of rose vines. Tiny pink blossoms embroidered at the hems gave her the look of a queen at once gentle and vibrant, though she was not yet crowned, of course. Her eyes scanned the courtyard. She recognized the Lannisters. Cersei's rigid stance, Joffrey's proud chin lifted high, Tyrion's watchful look from behind the crowd. They had come to welcome her. After all, she was soon to be wed to the Boy King. Joffrey stepped forward to greet her. He had the stance of a lion, chest puffed out, a short step behind him marking his retinue. The crown perched on his curls glinted in the sun. He was younger than she might have preferred. She had often mused that even though he was only a handful of years her junior, he sometimes struck her as little more than a boy dressed in a king's clothes. Yet Margaery was no stranger to the game of court. She bowed gracefully, lowering her gaze just enough to signal respect. He took her hand, looking faintly smug. "Lady Margaery," he said, "you are most welcome in King's Landing. I thank you for your warm welcome, your grace," she replied softly, letting a gentle, appreciative smile bloom on her lips. "I trust one find you well." A short nod. He looked her over with bold interest. Margaery knew precisely what she was meant to be in his eyes. A trophy, a conquest, something beautiful to show off to the realm, and likely to torment, given his capricious nature. But she also knew that she had the entire reach of Highgarden behind her, not to mention the cunning of her grandmother. If Joffrey thought her malleable, so much the better. Let him think that. Cersei Lannister glided forward next, exuding that cold grace that seemed to flow in her blood. "We are delighted to have you here," she said through perfectly painted lips, though the stiffness around her eyes suggested otherwise. "Your betrothal came at a most fortuitous time." Margaery curtsied to the Queen Regent, meeting her gaze with practiced warmth. "We Tyrells are glad to be of service to the crown. I'm sure our union will bring great prosperity to the realm." She felt Cersei's eyes linger on her face. There was no small tension there, the tension of two women who knew how courtly power moved, who recognized each other as potential rivals. Cersei gave a tight, polite smile, turning on her heel to guide them inside. Margaery followed, allowing herself a moment to sweep her gaze over the gathered courtiers. Many watched her with envy, others with dread, but the chatter in the courtyard was unanimous. The Tyrell girl was here, and the wedding was imminent. The future of the realm might turn on this very day. As they crossed the threshold of the Red Keep's grand doors, Margaery let her mind drift to the intricacies of the alliance. At her side was her father, Mace Tyrell, beaming like a man who had just planted the greatest seed in the realm's richest soil. Behind them, the Tyrell guards and ladies-in-waiting formed a bright procession. Margaery's grandmother, the formidable Olenna Tyrell, had preceded them by a few days, but the Queen of Thorns preferred to keep to her own schedule. Margaery was sure that Lady Olenna was already busily at work, spinning her webs of influence among the lords and ladies. Let no one underestimate the Tyrells. They were a family that knew how to cultivate advantage, how to transplant themselves in new soil and blossom. They reached the throne room with its vast space and polished marble floors. The sun's rays cut through the high windows, casting bars of light across the ground. Joffrey led them in, and the echo of footsteps resonated like a quiet drumbeat. Margaery felt a swirl of emotions. She had once believed in Renly, or at least believed in the idea that he could be a pleasant, even if not wholly just king for the realm. But he had perished under mysterious circumstances on the eve of battle. There was no time to mourn, no time to question. House Tyrell turned to the next best advantage, forging an alliance with the Lannisters at King's Landing. It had been swift, like the snapping of a rose's thorn. One day they were at Storm's End, and the next they had allied with House Lannister. Now Margaery stood before the Iron Throne itself. The massive, jagged seat seemed to swallow the dais in wrought, melted swords. Joffrey ascended the steps with a boyish eagerness. She thought she saw him glance her way to see if she was suitably impressed or intimidated by the sight. She was not. She had steeled herself. "You will soon be my queen," he announced, turning to address the courtiers gathered in the hall. "I trust you shall all give Lady Margaery the respect and loyalty she deserves. My wedding to her will take place at the Great September of Baelor in 3 weeks' time." It was all happening so quickly. Courtiers exchanged murmurs, and Margaery bowed her head in acknowledgement of the applause that followed. It was polite applause, some sincere, some forced. But the realm had grown used to wedding politics in these times of war, and soon enough, the War of the Five Kings might be overshadowed by the war of alliances, marriages, and betrayals. In the days that followed, Margaery immersed herself in the life of King's Landing with a determination to root out every bit of knowledge she could glean. She walked among the small folk in her charitable tours, handing out bread and coin, earning the crowd's adoration. This was something she had learned well in Highgarden. Winning hearts was as crucial as winning wars. While Cersei viewed the small folk as background extras in the stage of her regal life, Margaery saw them as a garden waiting for her to tend. The Tyrell sigil was a rose. Feeding the people was in many ways second nature to their house's reputation. The city's poor might only matter in times of riot, but Margaery recognized how a queen's popularity among them could shift the tides of public mood. Ever polite, she joined the Lannisters for dinners and listened demurely as Joffrey boasted about his crossbow skills, or how he would one day lead grand campaigns against traitors. She endured Cersei's scrutiny, answering the Queen Regent's passive-aggressive remarks with gentle grace, always deflecting with a compliment or a subtle diversion. In private, she conferred with her grandmother, who remained in the shadows of the royal apartments when she wasn't holding court among the ladies in the gardens. Olenna Tyrell possessed a sharpness that sliced through any illusions. She wasted no time in fortifying Margaery's position. "We cannot trust that boy," Olenna said on one breezy afternoon, as they sat within Margaery's new solar, "but we can trust his position. He's the king, and Lannister gold is the only thing keeping that throne stable." She plucked a grape from a platter, popped it into her mouth, and chewed thoughtfully. "Until your wedding vows are spoken, we maintain the outward appearance of devotion. After that, we'll see." Margaery knew the path ahead would be fraught with challenges. Joffrey's cruelty wasn't a rumor. Stories from Sansa Stark's time as his betrothed had spread widely enough. Nonetheless, Margaery believed that with the right mixture of kindness, flattery, and if necessary a well-timed threat, she could manage him. She was no frightened northern girl. She had her family behind her, and as soon as the alliance was officially sealed, the power of Highgarden would buttress the Iron Throne. The Tyrell maneuvers, though, didn't go unnoticed. Tyrion Lannister, the Hand of the King, watched them with intellectual curiosity. Varys, the Master of Whisperers, fluttered about with his secrets and half-smiles. Baelish lurked in the background, always with a cunning gleam in his eye. The politics of King's Landing was a chessboard, and every occupant of the Red Keep sought to place themselves to best advantage. Accelerating the wedding had given the Tyrells a sudden surge in influence. Some felt threatened, others saw opportunity. Margaery, wise beyond her years, knew she had to handle each player with caution. Days became a swirl of official gatherings and discreet conferences. Margaery took care to spend measured time with Sansa Stark, who was still mourning the destruction of her family's position. Margaery understood that Sansa, though displaced, remained the daughter of a great northern house. Her claim or her influence might still matter one day. Better to befriend her. From Sansa, she heard more about Joffrey's temper, the humiliations, the threats. Margaery listened sympathetically, consoling the girl as best she could, and gleaned crucial insights into how Joffrey's mind worked. It was all part of the slow weaving of alliances that Margaery needed. On the nights before the wedding, the great September of Baelor was abuzz with preparations. An influx of Tyrell bannermen arrived from the Reach, flooding King's Landing with fresh supplies of fruit, wine, meats, and flowers. The city brightened at the promise of a royal wedding that would see no shortage of feasts or lavish displays. Even the commoners might get a crust of bread and a cup of wine to mark the occasion. The Goldcloaks found themselves working tirelessly to keep the peace and manage the flow of visitors. At last, the day came, the wedding itself, a shimmering affair set to happen in the mid-morning. The great September doors were thrown open, letting in the morning light. Incense perfumed the air, and the statues of the seven loomed like silent watchers. Tapestries of gold and green draped the pews, representing the newly joined houses. Margaery arrived in a litter borne on the shoulders of Tyrell men. She wore a gown embroidered with roses and lions entwined, symbolizing the unification of House Tyrell and House Baratheon Lannister. Her hair was half up, woven with tiny golden roses. The rest spilled down her back in soft curls. As she stepped out of the litter, guided by her father's hand, she could feel the eyes of the capital upon her. The hush that fell in the sept was tangible. With a controlled breath, she entered, walking the long aisle, each step measured, each movement full of composure. The High Septon awaited her at the altar, and beside him stood King Joffrey, dressed in a gilded doublet, a crown of rubies and gold perched upon his golden curls. Even from a distance, she could sense his excitement, perhaps excitement at the spectacle, at having a bride who was known for her beauty, at once again putting his power on display. Margaery wondered if Sansa sat among the guests, hidden in the crowd of lords and ladies, witnessing her replacement. She tried not to think of it as betrayal. It was simply the way the wheels of power turned. House Tyrell needed this, and at the rate the wedding had been arranged, no one in King's Landing had the time to question or intervene. She came to stand beside Joffrey, who gave her a small, triumphant smile. The ceremony began. The droning of the septons, the recitation of vows, the binding of hands. Margaery spoke her part with genuine confidence, pledging her loyalty and devotion to the king. Perhaps that devotion was not from the heart. Her heart had never truly been Joffrey's, but it was from the mind, from the knowledge that this marriage was more than personal. It was a bond that might shift the fate of a kingdom. When the ceremony concluded, thunderous applause filled the September flower petals rained down from the upper balconies, drifting in pink and white flurries around the newly married king and queen. Margaery turned to the gathered crowd, wearing a radiant smile, and let herself bask in the momentary adoration. She saw Tyrion clapping politely, Cersei's face taut in forced pleasure, and Mace Tyrell near tears with pride. Olenna wore a small, satisfied grin, tapping her cane lightly as she joined in the applause. The sweet music of pipes and lutes flowed through the sept. King Joffrey led his new queen out to the steps of the Great September, where the city had gathered in throngs to cheer. He raised Margaery's hand high, as if displaying a prized victory. The cheers were loud, though Margaery recognized some of it was for the feasting that would come. Still, she waved, gracious and poised, feeling the cameras of the realm, if such things existed, focus on her. In that moment, she was unstoppable. She was queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and House Tyrell stood at her back. The wedding feast took place in the royal gardens within the Red Keep, an affair no less grand than any festival. Tables laden with roast swan, suckling pig, lemon cakes, honeyed fruits, and the best arbor wines. Musicians strolled, Minstrels sang of the union. Jugglers performed feats with swords. The newlyweds sat on a raised dais, Joffrey delighting in the attention. Margaery participated with the same perfect warmth, playing the gracious hostess, ensuring that lords from every region felt seen, from Dorne to the Vale. Though she laughed at Joffrey's jokes, inside she remained cool and calculating. She caught Tyrion's assessing gaze from time to time, as though he sensed she was not as simple or docile as her outward manner implied. She caught Cersei's gaze, too, the Queen Regent's lips pressed into a thin line. She doubted that Cersei enjoyed relinquishing even a shred of the spotlight, or seeing her son's affections, however fleeting, directed toward a new queen. But the joy was all for show. The realm, battered by war and rumors of more war, needed the illusion of merriment and stability. And so the feast carried on, and Margaery Tyrell became Margaery Baratheon, Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. In the days that followed, the shift in power was palpable. King Joffrey presided over the small council, but Margaery now had a seat of her own, at least a figurative one. She had no direct title in council affairs, but her opinions were suddenly sought, or at least politely acknowledged. Mace Tyrell joined the King's Council, representing the strength of the Reach. The coffers of House Tyrell, and the bounty of its fields, ensured that the city would not starve as easily as it had in recent memory. The Lannisters, struggling with the war's costs, could hardly afford to spurn their new ally. Each day, Margaery made sure to be present when Joffrey received visitors or held audiences. She would stand near him, an image of gentle partnership, her voice calm whenever the king's temper flared. She counseled him softly, leaning in to whisper reassurance. The small folk noticed that the new queen had a palliative effect on Joffrey, at least in public. On more than one occasion, she discreetly intervened to keep Joffrey from ordering some harsh or lethal punishment over trivial slights, turning his attention toward more noble pursuits. The courtiers whispered about Queen Margaery's influence, how she diffused tensions with a smile or a kind word. It was a skill she had honed for years at Highgarden, and now she used it to maintain at least a semblance of peace in the Red Keep. Privately, Joffrey was still Joffrey, volatile, sometimes cruel, eager to boast, but Margaery navigated his moods as one might navigate a labyrinth, carefully noting each corner, each shift in expression, coaxing him toward calmer waters. She fed his vanity by praising his strong leadership and kingly wisdom, letting him bask in such flattery. Whenever he grew restive, she offered him new amusements, arranging hunts, archery contests, or elaborate feasts. She was not naive about his darker inclinations, but she carefully steered him away from the worst ones. Each day that passed without an outburst or a public scandal was a small victory, one that allowed the Tyrell hold on King's Landing to tighten quietly. Cersei watched all this with increasing wariness. She saw Margaery's hand in the king's improved popularity among the small folk, saw how her philanthropic visits garnered cheering crowds. Where once the people had cursed the name of Joffrey and murmured support for Stannis or Robb Stark, they now seemed more willing to give the crown a chance. The Tyrell grain shipments certainly helped. With full bellies, men are less inclined to riot. Yet Cersei resented the new queen's ascendancy. Over private suppers, she would voice her suspicions to Joffrey, warning him that the Tyrells were cunning, that they might try to usurp Lannister influence. Joffrey, drunk on adoration, found it hard to heed warnings against his lovely bride, who seemed to admire him so earnestly. He would brush off his mother's comments, dismissing them as jealousy. That only fueled the tension. Lord Tywin, however, was more pragmatic. The Tyrell alliance was indispensable. He recognized Margaery's skill in maintaining the veneer of a gentler court, which in turn stabilized the crown's position. As long as the Tyrells remained loyal, House Lannister's seat on the Iron Throne was safer. Tywin was not a man to let personal vanity blind him to political reality. If Margaery's presence kept Joffrey's more destructive impulses at bay, so much the better. Meanwhile, in the small council chambers, the Tyrells began to assert influence in policy. Mace Tyrell was no political genius, often pompous and easily flattered, but Olenna Tyrell worked through him like a puppeteer. Her quiet counsel, funneled through Mace's lips or at times delivered in private to Tyrion or Varys, shaped decisions about provisioning the city, forging new trade routes, and offering pardons to certain rebellious lords. As a result, the realm's political tapestry started to shift. The Tyrell presence gave the crown a more benevolent face, especially to those houses that had once aligned with Renly. In the Riverlands, the war raged on. The Tullis and Starks persisted in their rebellion. Robb Stark remained undefeated in the field for a time, but the tide of the war was beginning to turn. Word of the Tyrell-Lannister union brought fresh morale to the royalist cause. Soldiers from the Reach bolstered key strongholds. The Tyrell navy, modest though it was compared to the Redwyne fleet, cooperated with Lannister forces to keep Blackwater Bay secure. Stannis Baratheon lurked on Dragonstone, battered from his defeat on the Blackwater, but he was not yet broken. He had the loyalty of many lords in the Stormlands, uneasy though they might be. The question on everyone's lips was whether Margaery's rapid marriage to Joffrey would alter the course of the war enough to crush the remaining resistance. Some believed that House Tyrell's gold and harvests would be enough to outlast any prolonged conflict. Others speculated that the realm might fracture in the face of so many claimants. Yet day by day, Margaery's presence, and the might of the Tyrell host, kept King's Landing more united than it had been in months. As the next few weeks went by, Margaery took advantage of her position. She organized small charitable events in Flea Bottom, distributing bread and stew. She invited Sansa Stark to these outings, giving the girl glimpses of a kind of queenly grace that might have shielded her had her father's fortunes not fallen. Sansa was shy, still traumatized by Joffrey's cruelty, but she admired Margaery's courage and resilience. Margaery, in turn, saw how Sansa's name still carried weight. She was the key to the North, in a way, and so Margaery cultivated a friendship with her, dropping subtle hints that Sansa might be happier and safer under the Tyrell roof, away from the Lannisters' direct sphere of intimidation. It was during one such outing, while Margaery and Sansa moved among the poor, that a small riot nearly broke out. A group of starving small folk cornered them, demanding more bread than was available. The Goldcloaks tensed, preparing for violence. Sansa clutched Margaery's arm, fear etched on her face. But Margaery stepped forward, facing the crowd. Without flinching, she spoke calmly, promising more food would arrive soon, begging them to remain peaceful. Something in her tone, her unflinching gaze, penetrated their anger. She instructed her guards to open the chest of coins that had been brought along, handing out silver stags. The tension ebbed. Though it was a dangerous moment, Margaery had shown she was willing to stand among them without fleeing. The city's rumor mill soon churned out stories of how the queen had bravely stood her ground, giving alms and comfort. Such tales spread quickly. Joffrey, hearing of the incident, was incensed that the small folk had dared threaten his queen. He raged that he should punish them severely, but Margaery soothed him, saying they were only hungry, that punishing the starving would win him no favor. She flattered him as a merciful and generous king, saying that magnanimity was a sign of true strength. She gifted him a new crossbow, a more finely wrought piece, and promised that once the war was won, they would both ride through the realm to show the people their king's courage. He preened under her praise and let the matter pass. Meanwhile, the city's adoration for Margaery only grew. That was the Tyrell hallmark, the subtle, steady turning of hearts. Court life swirled with gossip, but now the Tyrells shaped more of that chatter than the Lannisters did. Each evening, Margaery would retire to her quarters, her ladies brushing out her hair, while she quietly listened to reports from her grandmother or her brother Loras, whom Joffrey had made a member of the Kingsguard. Loras stood guard at her door often, and they shared hushed words about the day's events. Though Loras was honorable and proud, he was no stranger to intrigue, having seen how House Tyrell moved behind the scenes. In these private moments, Margaery sometimes allowed herself to feel the weight of her new role. She was queen now, queen to a king she neither loved nor trusted. The illusions she cast during the day wore thin by night, and she found herself needing a moment to breathe. Still, she pressed on, because she believed that in doing so, she was steering the realm, however gently, toward stability, or at least away from the darkest impulses of Joffrey's reign. One night, a moonless sky draped kings landing in darkness. The torches along the castle walls cast flickering shadows. Joffrey was in a foul mood, having received news that Robb Stark had once again outmaneuvered a Lannister host in the west. The king threw a fit in his private chambers, smashing a goblet of wine. Margaery arrived at his summons, carefully stepping over shards of glass. The tension in the air coiled like a viper. "They're laughing at me," Joffrey hissed, pacing. "That wolf pup runs free, mocking the crown. I want him dead. Do you hear me? I want his head on a spike." Margaery approached carefully, her hands folded at her waist. "Of course, my king. The armies of Highgarden stand ready to march when needed. The day is yours to claim." He turned a wild eye on her, searching her face for any hint of doubt. "Then why haven't they marched already? Where is the Tyrell valor?" She offered a soft, placating smile. "It takes time to deploy armies effectively, my love. My father, Lord Tyrell, is conferring with Lord Tywin on the best strategy. The Stark boy can't stand against the combined might of the Reach and the Westerlands forever. You must trust that the tides of war will turn." Joffrey's hand clenched around the hilt of a decorative dagger he wore even in his private chambers. Margaery eyed it calmly, ignoring the spike of fear that rose in her chest. She had heard the stories of what Joffrey did when angered, but in her presence, he always performed some version of the chivalrous king, though an edgy one. She knew to keep him sated on compliments, to feed him illusions of control. "Do you think I'm a fool?" Joffrey demanded. "Do you think I'm weak?" "Never," she replied. "You are the rightful king, strong and wise. The war is not about a single victory or loss. It is about wearing down your foes, making them regret their rebellion." His grip relaxed slightly. He let out a breath. Yes, you're right. We'll make them all regret this treason." He reached out for her, less in affection than in a desire to claim something tangible to calm himself. Margaery forced a tender smile, letting him pull her closer. Inwardly, she steeled herself, hoping that Loras was standing guard within earshot if things took a turn for the worse. But Joffrey merely sank onto a cushioned bench, letting her stand close as he rambled about the heads he wished to mount on the castle walls. She endured it, nodding at intervals, soothing him with the gentle hum of agreement. Eventually, his mood dulled, his anger spent. Then she excused herself with a sweet goodnight. In the hallway, she released a quiet breath of relief. Loras caught her eye, and she offered a small, reassuring nod. This was the game she had signed up for. The marriage had been forced by circumstance, but she intended to master it. The Tyrells would not be overshadowed by the Lannisters again, not so long as she had influence over the king's thoughts, his counsel, and the hearts of the small folk. At a small council meeting the next morning, Margaery's father and Lord Tywin pored over maps of the Riverlands. Joffrey presided at the head of the table, flanked by Cersei, Tyrion, and Varys. A hush fell as Margaery entered, though a queen did not typically attend such matters. However, she had come at Joffrey's invitation. He liked to display her, to show how even in war councils, he had the loveliest queen by his side. Cersei narrowed her eyes, displeased. Tyrion merely flicked a glance at Margaery, a spark of amusement lurking in his features. Tywin placed a marker on the map. "Here is where the Stark boy achieved his last victory. He has forced a retreat of Lord Brax's forces. We need to reallocate additional men from the Reach if we are to hold Harrenhal as a strategic foothold." Mace Tyrell nodded eagerly. "We stand ready to send 10,000 men to reinforce. If we can crush the Stark boy in open battle, this rebellion will end. The North cannot march on King's Landing itself, not with winter approaching eventually." Tyrion drummed his fingers on the table. "Stark is cunning. He avoids direct confrontation unless he's certain of an advantage. We do well not to underestimate him." Joffrey leaned forward, a sneer forming on his lips. "Then we trap him, send decoys to lure him in, show him that he has no chance." He glanced at Margaery. "Wouldn't you agree, my queen?" She offered a demure nod, carefully avoiding full commitment. "I trust Lord Tywin's wisdom in these matters. He has proven himself the realm's most capable commander." That simple statement stroked both Joffrey's ego, by implying the Lannisters' success was his success, and Tywin's pride. Tywin dipped his head in acknowledgement, though his expression remained cool. "We will finalize the plans, Your Grace, and have the troops prepared within the fortnight. The Tyrell men will march from Highgarden, linking with forces out of the Westerlands. We'll converge in the Riverlands and squeeze the rebels from both sides." Margaery felt a swell of determination. This was precisely what House Tyrell had aimed for, direct involvement in shaping the war's outcome. By commanding the movements of their own men, the Tyrells retained leverage. If the Lannisters needed Tyrell swords to claim victory, then the Tyrells would have a greater say in the realm's future once the war ended. And if, by some means, the war turned again, the Tyrells could choose how and when to act. In the meantime, life in King's Landing settled into a new rhythm under the watchful eye of its young queen. Margaery continued her philanthropic visits, joined by her ladies and sometimes by Sansa. The city, so often tense and hungry, felt a small reprieve. Garden fetes in the Red Keep became a regular occurrence. Magnificent displays of food, dancing, and music, all designed to engender loyalty toward the crown. Whenever Joffrey made an appearance, Margaery remained at his side, her smile bright, her conversation deftly guiding him away from any subject that might ignite his ire. At court, foreign envoys marveled at the difference in atmosphere. Where King's Landing had once seemed on the brink of riot after riot, it now had a veneer of prosperity and hope. Not everyone was convinced. Some courtiers muttered that the Tyrells were trying to overshadow the Lannisters. Others whispered that Joffrey's cruelty was only tempered temporarily. And beneath the surface, intrigue still abounded. Varys quietly gathered secrets, Littlefinger played his own sly games, and the faith of the Seven pressed for more concessions. Margaery was aware that many eyes watched her every move. She needed to be perfect, or at least appear so. That perfection was tested on a day not long after another Tyrell relief shipment arrived in the city. A rumor started circulating that the king had executed a group of peasants for complaining too loudly near the Red Keep gate. The rumor spread like wildfire. The small folk, who had begun to trust in Margaery's benevolence, turned anxious. Had their queen's influence failed? Margaery, hearing of this rumor, set out at once to discover the truth. It turned out to be a half-truth. The peasants had threatened a gold cloak with violence. The guards had overreacted, killing 2 in the scuffle. Joffrey had not directly ordered the execution, but the story grew in the telling. Margaery knew she must intervene to preserve her image and to keep the city from spiraling into fear. She convened a meeting with the High Septon and orchestrated a public moment of mourning for the victims, offering alms to their families, paying for a small funeral ceremony. She insisted Joffrey, or at least an official from the crown, attend and speak a few words of regret, spinning the incident as a tragic misunderstanding. The High Septon blessed the sight, and Margaery personally handed out bread and coins to the mourning relatives. The event quickly became part of the city's gossip, overshadowing the initial rumor. Behind closed doors, Joffrey grumbled that it was absurd to apologize for the gold cloaks simply doing their job. Margaery placated him, suggesting that his appearance of mercy was a sign of undisputed power. Only the weak-spirited refused to appear merciful. Only kings who felt threatened by their subjects showed no remorse. Joffrey, flattered, begrudgingly accepted her logic. As the weeks rolled into months, and the Tyrell Lannister armies marched into the Riverlands, reports came in of battles fought and lost, battles fought and won. The war was still a labyrinth of shifting alliances, but gradually the royalist forces began to regain ground. The supply lines from the Reach allowed the army to remain fed, a critical advantage over the sometimes depleted Stark forces. The freed rivermen who had once joined the young wolf started to grow uncertain. The Westerlands and the Reach pressed from opposite directions, forcing the rebels into narrower corridors. Meanwhile, King's Landing flourished in a cautious calm. Margaery's presence at court became integral to everything. Even Cersei could not deny that the realm looked more stable under the new queen's care. Yet the tension between mother and bride remained. There were glances that passed between them, unspoken challenges. Whenever Margaery made a new philanthropic move, Cersei found some reason to undermine it. But Margaery endured, always with that polite, sweet exterior, never giving Cersei a direct reason to challenge her openly. One late afternoon, while strolling in the Red Keep's gardens, Margaery encountered Lady Olenna, who waved her cane to beckon her closer. The older woman wore her signature headdress and shawl, embroidered with intricate floral designs. Around her, the smell of lemon verbena drifted, mixing with the garden's blossoms. "How does our precious king fare today?" Olenna asked, her tone dripping with amusement. Margaery offered a small sigh. "He's grown bored with court life since the war effort has moved to the Riverlands. He's demanding more hunts, more entertainments." Olenna clicked her tongue. "He's a peevish boy, that one. You've done well to keep his temper in check, even if it's only for the sake of appearances. Sometimes I wonder if we might have been better off letting someone else claim the throne." She looked around to ensure no one was listening too closely. "Still, we are where we are, and the Tyrell banners fly over King's Landing every bit as prominently as the lion now. That is no small feat." Margaery nodded. She glanced at a cluster of roses, a symbol so close to her heart and her house. "Do you think our hold here is truly secure?" she asked quietly. "Cersei grows more suspicious by the day. Tyrion is clever. He sees more than he lets on. Varys and Baelish are each playing their own games. We have Father, but he's not the sharpest blade in the armory. Lord Tywin is formidable. They'll not let us rule uncontested. And Joffrey, he's so unpredictable." Olenna patted her granddaughter's hand. "Power in King's Landing has always been a slippery fish. But you, my dear, have the advantage of being beloved. Keep feeding that image, Queen of the People, Queen of the Bounty. Ensure the men of the Reach remain loyal, and the Lannisters will need us more than we need them." Margaery smiled at her grandmother's confidence. In truth, she felt a growing sense of agency. Each day she guided Joffrey, shaped the people's perception, and gently nudged policy. When the war ended, and it would end eventually, the winners would divide the spoils. She intended House Tyrell to stand tall among those victors. Late that evening, Joffrey demanded Margaery's presence in the throne room for a private spectacle. She arrived, curiosity piqued. A handful of gold cloaks stood around, and in the center of the vast hall knelt a trembling man with chains on his wrists. Joffrey perched on the iron throne, a crossbow resting across his lap. He beckoned her forward. "This man," Joffrey declared, "was caught trying to poison our food stores." Margaery's eyes flicked to the prisoner, a skinny wretch, eyes bloodshot with fear. She had no knowledge of any real poisoning attempt. It could be a rumor twisted by some unscrupulous officer, or it could be the truth. "What would you have done, my queen?" Joffrey asked, feigning a gracious air. "Shall I spare him, or shall I punish him for his treason?" She could see that he delighted in the show. This was a test. He wanted to see if she would be as merciful as she claimed. But to intervene too openly might risk looking soft on treason. She weighed her words carefully. "If the evidence is certain, the penalty for attempted regicide is death," she said quietly, stepping closer to Joffrey, letting her voice carry just enough that the gold cloaks could hear. "But sometimes a tortured mind can be led astray by hunger or threats. Perhaps we should discover who put him up to it before punishing him." Joffrey's smile thinned, the corners of his mouth turning cruel. "See, men?" he addressed the gold cloaks. "My queen is kind-hearted. She wants to unravel the conspiracy. Very well. Take him to the dungeons. Have the questioners do their work." The wretch shuddered, but relief crossed his face that he was not to be executed on the spot. Joffrey then lifted the crossbow, aimed it, and released a bolt at the man's leg. The prisoner let out a scream, collapsing. Margaery did not flinch outwardly, though her stomach twisted. This was her daily reality. a husband who found pleasure in hurting others. All she could do was try to minimize the damage. She placed a gentle hand on Joffrey's shoulder to appease him, as if to say, "You are strong, no one questions it." The gold cloaks dragged the shrieking prisoner away. Joffrey rose, letting the crossbow drop lazily at his side. "I grow tired of these dull conspiracies," he said. "No one dares face me directly." Margaery forced a bright tone. "That is a testament to your power, my king. None would dare stand against you in open battle." She let her hand linger on his arm, hoping it would keep him from further cruelty. "Shall we retire? We have a feast prepared, if you would like to celebrate your vigilance over the realm." He smirked. "Yes, let's. I'm bored with this." She guided him out of the throne room, leaving behind a smear of blood on the marble floor, a chilling reminder of what simmered under the surface. Outside, she breathed a silent sigh. Another day, another crisis navigated. But how many more times would she need to do this? With the war raging, the tension mounting between the Lannisters and Tyrells despite their alliance, Margaery felt the burdens stacking on her shoulders like bricks. She had to endure. Soon, news arrived that Tyrell and Lannister forces had pushed further into the Riverlands, seizing strategic crossroads. The tide of the war seemed to favor the crown. Robb Stark's unstoppable march had been slowed by logistical shortages, betrayals among certain riverlords, and the unceasing pressure from the combined armies. Each raven that arrived bore more hopeful tidings for the royalist cause. The mood in King's Landing lifted, though Margaery worried that a sense of premature victory might lead to complacency. One afternoon, Sansa came to see her in Margaery's solar. The girl appeared anxious, eyes flickering to the corners of the room as if worried about eavesdroppers. Margaery offered her a seat on a plush bench near the window, where warm sunlight filtered through. "What troubles you, my dear?" Margaery asked softly, dismissing her maids to give them privacy. Sansa swallowed, her cheeks pale. "There are rumors that the Lannisters plan to make a marriage pact for me. Lord Baelish has spoken of it, too." Margaery reached out and gently squeezed Sansa's hand. "I've heard similar whispers. They see you as a piece in the game. But do not despair, you are not without friends. My grandmother and I are trying to keep you out of the worst hands." Sansa's eyes "Thank you," she said, voice trembling. "I'm so afraid of being forced to marry a man like Joffrey, or someone worse." Margaery shushed her gently. "We will do what we can." She paused, choosing her words. "House Tyrell might offer you a match that would keep you safe and away from their plots." Indeed, Olenna had mentioned the idea of wedding Sansa to Willis Tyrell, the heir of Highgarden, though that plan might not come to fruition with the Lannisters watching so closely. But the seeds were planted. If they could secure Sansa Stark's claim to the north through a Tyrell match, House Tyrell would gain an even stronger foothold in the realm. Margaery knew the game well. Gather the great houses under the Tyrell banner. As the day wore on, Margaery escorted Sansa back to her quarters, mindful of the watchful eyes in the corridors. Every passing guard, every lady-in-waiting, could carry a tale. Margaery parted from Sansa with a soft promise to speak again soon. She recognized the interplay of pity and ambition in her own heart. She pitied Sansa's plight truly, yet also saw how an alliance with House Stark would be another rose in the Tyrell garden. Another moonless night fell over the city. Margaery stood on a balcony overlooking the Blackwater, the river's dark surface reflecting distant torchlight. The shape of the city's rooftops stretched out below her, and in the far-off gloom, one could just make out the Iron Fleet's watchful presence near the mouth of the bay. Olenna joined her, quietly stepping onto the balcony with surprising agility for her age. They stood there for a time, letting the sea breeze ruffle their hair and shawls. "It's good the wedding came when it did," Olenna said at last, her voice subdued. "Your presence here has ensured that House Tyrell reaps every benefit from the alliance. If we'd waited, or if your marriage to Renly had lasted, the outcome might have been very different." Margaery nodded, her gaze on the horizon. She had grown used to these moments of reflection, where the threads of the past and present wove together to form a precarious future. Sometimes I think about Renly, she admitted. Not with love exactly, but he was kind, at least kinder than some. He had faults, but they were faults I could manage. Olenna clicked her tongue. He was an empty cloak, that one. But a handsome face with a warm smile can sometimes carry a man far. Never mind that now. You are queen. We must ensure you remain queen until the realm is ours to shape. The older woman laid a hand on Margaery's shoulder. Remember, child, even the most splendid rose has to survive pests, storms, and droughts. You were planted here in King's Landing, and you must bloom despite the filth. One day you may find a way to rid yourself of the pests, but until then, keep your head high. Margaery offered a small, grateful smile. Thank you, grandmother. From behind them, they heard the faint echo of footsteps. One of Margaery's ladies came, a slip of parchment in hand, informing her that the king was requesting her company for another small event. The demands never ended. Margaery took the parchment, dismissed the lady, and exchanged a knowing look with Olenna. The queen's duties called. Stepping away from the balcony, Margaery made her way through the corridors. Each footstep echoed in the hush. Torches guttered in their sconces, casting wavering shadows. Passing by a window, she caught her reflection. A regal young woman in a gown of shimmering gold, her hair intricately braided, a gentle smile upon her lips. Yet behind the exterior, there lived a watchful serpent waiting in the rose garden. She understood the game she played. When she arrived at Joffrey's chambers, she found him drinking with a small group of courtiers who indulged his every whim. He beckoned her with a smug grin. "My queen, we were just discussing how best to celebrate our next victory when the Stark boy is finally caught." He patted a place beside him. She moved to sit, wondering how to keep him from any cruelty that might arise in his drunken state. She nodded to the courtiers, acknowledging them with polite words. Music played softly in the background, a lute strumming a lively tune. One of the courtiers poured her a goblet of wine. Joffrey began describing an elaborate celebration he envisioned, complete with hunts and feasts and tournaments. Margaery sipped her wine, smiling at the appropriate moments, offering suggestions for amusements that would please the knights and lords alike. She did so without missing a beat, carefully molding the conversation to keep him boasting and not raging. As the night wore on, the courtiers, swayed by wine, drifted away one by one until only Joffrey and Margaery remained. He slouched on a cushioned seat, swirling the dregs of wine in his goblet, eyes half-lidded. "You will give me an heir," he said suddenly, his voice slurred. "A strong prince to carry on my line." Margaery inclined her head. "In time, my lord. The gods will bless us when they see fit." Inside, she felt a swirl of conflicting emotions. She wanted no child of Joffrey's, certainly not yet. But outwardly, she played the dutiful bride. Joffrey leaned closer, a twisted sneer forming. "If the gods don't hurry, I'll make them see fit." He let out a barking laugh at his own jest, downing the last of his wine. She kept her composure, though her skin prickled. The thought of bearing this man's child was unsettling. But her face betrayed nothing. "You will have your heir. The realm will celebrate." He snorted, pushing himself to stand, swaying slightly. "Yes, they will. They will bow before me and my son. And the Tyrells. They think they're so clever. But I know that without me, they're nothing." Margaery gently rose, looping her arm through his to steady him. "We are all in service to the crown, my king," she whispered, guiding him toward the door of his bedchamber. "And you wear the crown." At that, Joffrey's sneer turned into a smug grin. He seemed pacified. "Yes, I do," he muttered, letting her help him. Once he was settled, Margaery withdrew. She walked through the dark corridors to her own chambers, heart pounding with a mix of relief and dread. She had managed him again. But for how long? Perhaps indefinitely. She had the resilience and cunning for it. The Tyrells had trained her well to be a mistress of courtly performance. Days turned into weeks. The war reports continued to favor the crown. the Tyrell Lannister alliance looked poised to secure the realm. The small folk, feeling the respite from hunger and chaos, praised the queen for her kindness and the Tyrell host for their bounty. The story of a blossoming golden age flickered at the edges of the capital's imagination. Of course, it was only a veneer. War still raged outside these walls, and Joffrey's cruelty remained. But with Margaery's careful manipulations, the darkest impulses were largely contained. At Highgarden's insistence, celebrations and tournaments were held more frequently, each one reinforcing the idea of a united, prosperous monarchy. Margaery became known not just for her beauty but for her generosity, forging a public image so strong that even the Lannisters dared not publicly undermine her. In private, Cersei seethed, but she lacked the political capital to strike effectively. Tywin tolerated the new queen, seeing in her an asset more than a threat, at least for now. Tyrion remained watchful, occasionally bantering with Margaery, acknowledging her skill. And if Baelish or Varys harbored their own designs, neither made a direct move against the Tyrell ascendancy. Finally, news came that Robb Stark had been decisively outmaneuvered. A key alliance had faltered for him, possibly due to Walder Frey or Roose Bolton, though the details were murky. The royal armies claimed victory in the field, scattering the northern host. Rumors said Robb Stark had fled west with a handful of loyal men, but his cause was all but lost. King's Landing erupted into jubilation. The war, for all intents and purposes, seemed nearing its end. Margaery breathed a silent sigh of relief. If the realm was close to peace, perhaps she could work toward genuine stability, reduce the bloodshed, see the realm begin to heal. Even if Joffrey would never be a benevolent king, perhaps she could channel his impulses away from cruelty. The potential for a better future glimmered like sunrise on the horizon. Yet, in a place like King's Landing, the seeds of new conflicts were always lurking. As soon as Robb Stark's threat diminished, the question arose of how to handle the remaining rebels, the fate of the Riverlands, the matter of punishing those who had not supported the throne quickly enough. Margaery knew these next steps would be delicate. The Tyrells were well positioned to influence negotiations, especially if they offered a gentler approach than the Lannisters' typical iron-handed punishments. In the meantime, House Tyrell tightened its hold on the capital. More Lords of the Reach were granted positions at court. The Red Keep's corridors filled with the scent of Highgarden's roses. Margaery encouraged the courtiers to adopt a sense of renewed optimism, hosting events that blended elegance with subtle politicking. With the approach of an end to the war, the people yearned for joy, and Margaery gave it to them. Feasts, dances, philanthropic gestures. Every gesture reeked of Tyrell cunning, though on the surface it was all golden generosity. Behind the scenes, Margaery sometimes found respite in the Godswood or the palace gardens, moments where she could breathe in solitude. There, she reminded herself that this was all bigger than one woman's happiness. She had to keep her family secure, keep the realm from fracturing further. If it meant enduring Joffrey's presence, so be it. And one day, if an opportunity arose, maybe she could shape the monarchy into something kinder. Whispers in the corridors sometimes spoke of an unholy truth, that King Joffrey was a product of incest, that the real heir should have been someone else. Margaery heard these rumors as well, but she buried them. She could not afford to question the legitimacy of her husband. That would unravel everything House Tyrell had built. So she kept her counsel, letting the gossip swirl, never letting it seed in her mind. The king's legitimacy might be a fragile foundation, but it was the one upon which her entire future currently stood. The day came when official word reached King's Landing of a major surrender in the Riverlands. Certain lords who had once supported the Tullus laid down their arms. Joyous celebrations erupted throughout the city. The king held court, proclaiming the war nearly won, granting small pardons and also condemning other traitors. Margaery watched from the throne at his side, mindful of the spectacle. At the height of this celebratory court session, Joffrey announced that there would be a grand tourney to commemorate the victory. Knights from all over the realm were invited. The city would feast for a fortnight. Margaery knew it was a means to keep the people distracted, to further cement the crown's popularity. If bread and circuses could quell the unrest, then so be it. House Tyrell had no objection. They thrived in pomp and pageantry, and so King's Landing filled with knights, lords, ladies, and merchants. The streets bustled like a festival. Margaery orchestrated a sumptuous welcoming feast, filling the capital with flowers, music, and laughter. Joffrey basked in adoration, believing that he was truly beloved. Cersei hovered at the edges, watchful, her expression unreadable. Tyrion mingled with foreign dignitaries, skillfully forging alliances. At the opening tilt, banners snapped in the breeze, and the stands were crowded with spectators. Margaery and Joffrey presided from the royal box. Loras Tyrell, the famed Knight of Flowers, took the field in his resplendent armor, receiving thunderous cheers. Joffrey, however, favored other knights who flattered him openly. Margaery encouraged him to cheer for all the champions, reminding him that as king, he should show generosity. She subtly guided him to grant small honors or trinkets to knights who performed impressively. Each gift was a bond forged, each courtesy an alliance strengthened. The Tyrell influence was tangible. Even the Lannister bannermen showed deference to Mace Tyrell and his retinue. After all, it was Tyrell gold and grain that had helped secure this near victory. The sight of the Golden Rose of Highgarden flying alongside the Lion of Lannister atop the tourney grounds was a promise of the new order, a realm under dual stewardship. Of course, not everyone was content. Some grumbled that the Tyrells were too ostentatious, that they flaunted their wealth, overshadowing even the crown. But there was little that could be done while the war raged on or while the city still craved Tyrell bread and wine. The future would hold its own battles for power, but for now the alliance stood strong. On the final day of the tourney, Margaery watched as the final justs played out. Loras unseated a half-dozen knights, earning accolades. Other champions clashed, lances splintering, cheers ringing in the air. Throughout it all, Margaery maintained her composure, smiling at the crowd, awarding favor to knights, sharing hushed jokes with Joffrey to keep him amused. She was the perfect queen, the perfect hostess, a bright flower in the midst of a battered kingdom. When at last the victor was declared, the stands erupted in applause. Joffrey stood, raising his arms in triumph for the champion. Margaery rose beside him, gracefully applauding. The final image would be etched into the city's collective mind. The young king and queen, radiant in victory, the Tyrell rose entwined with the Baratheon stag and the Lannister lion. Thus did the Tyrell grip on King's Landing tighten, day by day, under the unassuming grace of a queen who had learned to conceal thorns within her petals. The faster wedding had indeed cemented Tyrell control in a way no one had quite foreseen. The repercussions of that union would shape the fate of the Seven Kingdoms long after the last lance shattered on the tourney field. And in the twilight of that final day's celebration, as Margaery retreated from the cheering crowds, she allowed herself a moment to breathe in the scent of roses, savoring the quiet knowledge. The Tyrells had taken root, and their blossoms would not soon fade. Margaery stepped away from the tumult of the final tourney day with a quiet sense of fulfillment. The celebratory cheers still echoed in the distance, mingling with the clang of gates and the soft roll of waves upon the Blackwater. She allowed herself a single wistful smile as she walked the Red Keep's corridors, feeling the hush of evening settling upon the castle. Outside, torchlight flickered along the battlements, a testament to the vigilance that remained despite the city's current euphoria. War had not yet vanished from the realm. It merely receded, like the tide pulled back from the shore. But in that moment, King's Landing seemed more stable than it had in years. She made her way toward her solar, her guards a respectful distance behind, her ladies-in-waiting nowhere in sight. She had told them to remain at the feast, encouraging them to enjoy themselves. Even queens required time to breathe without a retinue watching every blink. Her footsteps fell softly on the stone floor, echoing faintly in the cavernous halls. Passers-by, including minor lords, knights, and servants, gave her a wide berth, bowing or curtsying. She offered them polite, if somewhat distracted, nods. Everyone recognized her now, not merely as a new arrival in King's Landing but as a powerful presence, a queen who had managed to calm the city's disquiet with a gracious smile and the bounty of her house. Upon reaching her solar, she paused at the door. There, standing with one hand on the latch, was Ser Loras Tyrell, her beloved brother. His white Kingsguard cloak draped over his shoulders, and his armor gleamed with the residual shine of the tourney's final justs. Though he had unseated many a foe, he bore no smugness in his gaze, only a serene concern. "Sister," he said softly, "I hope to speak with you before retiring for the night." She offered him a warm smile. "Of course, Ser Loras. I was just about to settle. Join me." He opened the door for her. Inside, the solar was lit by a series of candles and a single brazier that lent a golden warmth to the chamber's shadows. The scent of lavender clung to the air. Margaery's ladies had readied the space for her, leaving a carafe of sweet arbor red on a table near the window. She drifted across the room, her gown trailing along the polished floor, and took a seat on a cushioned bench before gesturing for Loras to join her. He hesitated, as if uncertain whether to remove his helm or stay in formal posture. At last, he took off his white-plumed helm and placed it on a side table, then settled beside her. They looked alike in many ways, the same deep brown hair, the same warmth to their features, though Loras's high cheekbones were sharper than hers, and the set of his jaw more grim than it had once been. War and court had worn away some of the innocence. "How did it feel to win so many bouts today?" she asked, pouring wine into a cup and offering it to him. "Did you enjoy your victory?" He accepted the wine but shrugged. "Victories in the yard are fleeting, my queen. The real battles are fought elsewhere." He cast a sidelong glance at the door, as if checking it was shut. "You handled Joffrey magnificently in the royal box." He seemed quite taken with his own glory, less likely to brood, at least for the day. Margaery sipped her wine. "He enjoys the show, and I'm content to let him. If he's busy delighting in splendor, he's less prone to cruelty." "Is it wearisome?" he asked softly. "Playing that part day after day?" A small laugh escaped her. "Sometimes, yes, yet I was raised for this." House Tyrell recognized that the real game in King's Landing is not just battle, but the weaving of alliances, the shaping of perception. She placed a hand over his, giving it a comforting squeeze. "And you, dear brother, have played your part too, more than admirably, even if you chafe under that white cloak. We all do what we must." Loras's eyes flickered with an emotion she recognized. Regret, longing, perhaps some memory of Renly. But he kept his voice even. "I serve our family. I serve you. I serve the king. So long as House Tyrell remains powerful, I suppose that is enough." He fell silent for a moment, then said, "Mother wishes to speak with you soon. She's been hosting gatherings of the noblewomen while the tourney raged, forging new ties. She said something about the Martells. There's talk that Dorne might grow restless if excluded from the peace settlements. She wants your help smoothing things over." Margaery tilted her head, the flicker of candlelight dancing in her eyes. "Lady Olenna always has a plan, doesn't she? I will meet with her on the morrow." A small twist of amusement curled her lips. "She never sleeps. I'm convinced she knows every rumor in the realm before anyone speaks it." They spoke a while longer, their conversation drifting from the war's progress to the personal matters of House Tyrell. It was a rare moment of closeness, a time to set aside the public performance and simply be siblings. But eventually, Loras took his leave, reminding her with a gallant bow that he would stand guard at her door later, if that was her wish. Margaery declined gently. Sometimes she needed the quiet anonymity of other Kingsguard for her night's rest. She trusted Loras, of course, but she worried about burdens on his mind. Let him find some peace for himself. Alone at last, she set aside her wine, let her maids unfasten her gown, and eased into a simpler dressing robe. Sleep, however, felt distant. Instead, she sank onto a window seat, gazing out at King's Landing beneath the moonlight. The city's glow stretched below like a tapestry, each flicker of torch or lantern part of the complicated weave that was the capital. In the far distance, the black waters glinted with the reflection of stars. Margaery wondered how many there were. Lights above, lights below, each telling a different story. Her mind wandered to the fates of the Northmen, to young Sansa Stark, to the uncertain alliances waiting to be forged in the aftermath of war. Where once she had believed that the realm could be guided by good intentions, she now saw more clearly how fear, ambition, and necessity shaped each step. The Tyrells had chosen to marry her to Joffrey with remarkable speed, positioning themselves for maximum advantage. She, in turn, had accepted that destiny. Now, she was queen of the Seven Kingdoms, and if she had any say in how the next chapter played out, she would ensure that House Tyrell, and perhaps even the common folk, benefited from the peace to come. Sleep eventually claimed her in the hush of the late hour. The next day dawned bright, the sky a startling blue above the city. Margaery rose early, as was her custom, and broke her fast on honeyed bread and fresh berries brought from the Reach. Since the wedding and the Tyrell shipments, King's Landing rarely lacked for produce, even in times of strain. She dressed in a flowing gown of pale green, embroidered with gold thread in the shape of entwining roses. Then, with her grandmother's summons in mind, she swept out of her chambers to find Lady Olenna. She discovered the Queen of Thorns in a small courtyard near Maegor's Holdfast, surrounded by several ladies of noble birth who had come for morning gossip. Olenna sat on a cushioned seat, nibbling at a scone, her sharp eyes belying her seemingly frail posture. The ladies around her included a pair of ladies from lesser houses sworn to the Reach, 2 from the Westerlands seeking Tyrell favor, and 1 from the Stormlands who had shifted allegiance swiftly after Renly's death. They all quieted and rose to curtsy as Margaery approached, addressing her as Your Grace. Olenna, with characteristic lack of ceremony, waved a hand. Yes, yes, back to your seats, we're all friends here. Then she beckoned Margaery closer. Come, child, join me. I was just telling Lady Mullar the difference between the real lemon cakes in Highgarden and the pitiful attempts at them in King's Landing. Margaery suppressed a smile. She settled into a chair beside Olenna, nodding a greeting to the assembled ladies. A servant poured her a cup of mint tea. The conversation meandered through trifles, recent marriages, talk of upcoming feasts, before Lady Olenna deftly guided the topic to politics. Margaery recognized her grandmother's skill in controlling the flow. Soon, they spoke of Lord Tywin's intentions for the Riverlands. Would the Tullus be permitted to retain any of their lands, or would they face disinheritance? Certain ladies speculated that the Freys would demand more territory as a reward for their betrayal of the Starks. Through it all, Margaery listened carefully, interjecting gentle remarks that suggested a queen's interest in the realm's stability. She never took a firm stance on any debate, merely smiled, nodded, and promised to inquire after the crown's will. It was enough to convey that she cared. Eventually, the ladies departed, each curtsying again to Margaery and bowing to Lady Olenna. When they were alone, Olenna set aside her half-eaten scone and spoke in a low tone. I hear talk that Dorne is restless. Prince Doran is not pleased he was left out of key negotiations, likely feeling slighted that no envoy was sent to Sunspear after the war turned in our favor. House Martell is hardly one to forget old grievances. Margaery inclined her head. Yes, Loras mentioned. What do you advise? Olenna pursed her lips. The Martells still simmer over Elaya's murder decades ago. The Lannisters can hardly blame them. Now that the war is ending, Dorne wants assurances of autonomy, perhaps marriage alliances. You, my sweet, might propose a betrothal between Trystane Martell and Myrcella Baratheon. Well, that was once suggested, but we can see if it still stands. It might soothe Dorne, though I suspect Cersei will balk at sending her daughter so far south. Margaery tapped her chin, thinking, if the king decrees it, Cersei's objections won't matter. But Joffrey will only do so if it pleases him, or if I can make him see it as a demonstration of his magnanimity. A ghost of a smile crossed Olenna's lips. Precisely. Show him how wise and generous he would appear by offering a princess's hand in marriage to the Martells. The Dornish can cling to their pride, and the realm avoids yet another rebellion. Meanwhile, the Tyrells remain the favored allies, the stabilizing force. It's what we do best, child. They spent a while plotting how best to present this idea to Joffrey. Olenna gave her granddaughter a wry wink, reminding her to couch every suggestion in the language Joffrey liked best. Flattery, illusions of absolute power, and the promise of further adoration from the people. Margaery accepted the advice with a quiet nod. She had perfected the art of guiding Joffrey's decisions by appealing to his vanity. If Dorne could be placated with a royal match, then King's Landing would maintain its precarious peace. Later that day, Margaery orchestrated a moment alone with Joffrey in one of the Red Keep's smaller gardens, a place where a gurgling fountain masked distant sounds of the city. He lay sprawled on a bench, fiddling with a short, ornately carved dagger. She approached with a gentle smile, wearing a gown of gold and cream damask. The sun glinted off the gold filigree at her sleeves. "Your Grace," she said, curtsying with deliberate elegance. He looked up, a smirk curling his lips. "My queen, you look radiant." She inclined her head in thanks, then settled beside him on the bench. "Have you recovered from the excitement of the tourney?" He scoffed lightly. "I'm bored, actually. There's not enough to do in peacetime. Everyone fawns and flatters, and no one dares challenge me. That's how it should be, is it not?" Margaery teased with a delicate laugh. "But if you're restless, we can arrange hunts or spectacles, even small contests of arms to keep the knights on their toes." He perked up slightly. "Maybe. I'd like something new. Perhaps I'll order a new demonstration of my crossbow or a hunt in the Kingswood. My dog, if I had one worth the name, would do well. But I suppose the hound is gone." His face twisted. "He fled during the Blackwater. A coward." Margaery smoothed a hand over Joffrey's wrist, quieting the sparks of temper. "We can find you better huntsmen. But there is another matter I'd like to discuss. An opportunity to display your wisdom and generosity as king." He lifted a brow. "Go on." She leaned in, letting her tone carry a hint of reverence. "Dorne has grown silent, and silence sometimes hides a grievance. If you were to reach out to honor them with a royal match, you might show the entire realm that you are a king who unites, not just conquers." Joffrey's eyes flickered with interest. "A royal match? With whom?" Margaery let her gaze drift over the fountain's surface. "There's your sister Myrcella. She is of an age to begin considering betrothals. Prince Trystane Martell is also near in age. It was once suggested by your council, but circumstances changed during the war." She felt the tension in his arm. Clearly, the thought of giving away Myrcella, particularly if Cersei opposed it, might stir complicated feelings. So she pressed on. "Think how it would appear to the lords of the Seven Kingdoms. A gracious gesture, forging an alliance with Dorne. The Martells would host your sister in splendor, and your rule would extend unchallenged, from the Stormlands all the way to the Summer Sea. The people would see your vision of unity, no more pockets of hidden rebellion." A slow grin spread across Joffrey's face. Margaery recognized that glint in his eye. He liked the notion of forcing others into compliance under the guise of generosity. "Yes, it would show them I'm not afraid of Dorne. I could place Myrcella there as a sign of my power. If they dare mistreat her, they would face my wrath." "Yes." He looked at Margaery. "Mother won't like it, though." She offered a supportive smile. "But you are the king. She must abide by your decision." He seemed pleased with that idea. "Yes, indeed. I'll speak with grandfather about it. We'll arrange the betrothal ceremony. Dorne will kneel or else." His voice carried its usual edge of cruelty, but Margaery let that pass. The important part was that he'd accepted the notion. Now she only needed to manage the fallout with Cersei, no small task. But if Cersei objected too forcefully, she would risk alienating her son. Margaery would see to it that Joffrey's pride in this wise decision overcame any motherly protests. They lingered in the garden a short while longer, discussing trifles, clothes, feasts, and the various gossip that made Joffrey laugh. Margaery was adept at reading his moods, guiding him away from darker topics. When at last she left him to attend to other duties, she felt a sense of accomplishment. Another step had been taken towards securing the realm's stability, and, by extension, the Tyrell's increasing influence. Sure enough, Cersei's displeasure soon manifested. Word reached Margaery through court gossip that the Queen Regent was fuming over the idea of sending Myrcella away. Margaery braced herself for the confrontation and found it not long in coming. She was walking through a corridor near the royal kitchens when Cersei swept around a corner, frowning like a thundercloud. "Your Grace," Margaery greeted with polite courtesy, dipping her head. "A pleasant morning, I trust?" Cersei's eyes narrowed. "I hear you've planted the notion in Joffrey's head that Myrcella should be sent off to Dorne. How bold of you, to meddle in Baratheon family matters without consulting me." Margaery knew better than to let her smile waver. "I suggested an alliance to benefit the crown and ensure the realm's peace. Surely we all want to avoid further rebellion." Cersei's lips pressed together in a thin line. She glanced around at the passing servants, who scurried away. Then, in a lower tone, she hissed, "I will not have my daughter sent away from me into the arms of those who still hate the Lannisters for Elia Martell's death. Doran Martell may be polite, but his brother Oberyn is a viper. How dare you push for something that endangers Myrcella?" Margaery inclined her head in a gesture of calm. "I understand your concern, but Joffrey is the king. He sees an advantage in forging a bond with Dorne. We cannot keep Myrcella in the Red Keep forever. She is a princess of the blood, after all, and alliances are made through marriage." Cersei took a step closer, her voice cold as steel. "You are cunning, Margaery, but do not think I'm ignorant of your ambitions. You Tyrells have wormed your way into every corner of the capital, distributing bread and roses to make the small folk adore you. Now you counsel my son on matters of state as if you were the king yourself." Margaery kept her expression serene, though her heart thudded. She had expected no less from Cersei eventually. The Queen Regent had tolerated Margaery's presence only so long as it served Joffrey's interests. Still, Margaery answered with unwavering grace. "I have no ambitions beyond ensuring the strength of the Iron Throne. Joffrey's success is my success, and the Tyrell's loyalty is assured. Surely you see that." Cersei's stare burned, but she was aware of the watchers in the corridor. She could not physically threaten the Queen, not without repercussion. Instead, she said icily, "We shall see, dear daughter-in-law, how loyal you truly are if storms return to these walls. Pray that your roses don't wither in winter's cold." Then she swept away, her red gold gown trailing behind like the tail of an angry dragon. Margaery watched her depart, maintaining her composure. Only when Cersei disappeared around another corner did she exhale. She felt a tremor in her hands. Indeed, she had faced down foes on the battlefield of courtesies before, but Cersei Lannister was not a woman to be dismissed. She was a lioness defending her cubs, with claws that cut deeply. Margaery reminded herself that caution was necessary. The Lannisters still held the largest share of military might in the city, and Tywin's cunning rivaled Olenna's. If Margaery pushed too far or too fast, she might provoke a backlash that even House Tyrell's position could not withstand. Nonetheless, she had achieved the immediate goal. Joffrey intended to betroth Myrcella to Trystane Martell, and that alone would open a pathway to peace with Dorne. With each new knot tied in the realm's tapestry, the crown grew more secure, yet so did House Tyrell's stake in that crown. If Cersei hated it, she would have to endure. Over the following weeks, the arrangement with Dorne moved forward in a flurry of diplomatic activity. Raven after raven flew between King's Landing and Sunspear. Prince Doran expressed interest, though carefully couched in polite remarks about ensuring Myrcella's well-being. Joffrey, at Margaery's guidance, demanded certain concessions, nothing too harsh, mostly gestures of loyalty and trade privileges for the crown. The end result was that a formal announcement was made at court. Princess Myrcella Baratheon would be betrothed to Prince Trystane Martell, and she would depart for Dorne within the season. Cersei's tight-lipped disapproval remained obvious, but she said little in open council. Lord Tywin, for his part, recognized the strategic wisdom of bringing Dorne into the fold with minimal bloodshed. Tyrion, as Hand of the King, offered measured support, though he gave Margaery a wry, knowing look whenever they crossed paths, as if to say, "I see your handiwork." She would respond with a polite tilt of her head. They each had their roles to play, and Tyrion appreciated that Margaery's influence kept Joffrey's worst impulses somewhat contained. Throughout all this, Margaery continued her charitable efforts among the small folk, ensuring that shipments of grain were distributed fairly. Loras and the Tyrell Guard patrolled the city, showing a gentler presence than the Goldcloaks sometimes did. With the war winding down, King's Landing saw fewer starving mouths. Still, there was always need, and Margaery made certain people remembered who fed them. In the minds of many, the Queen was nearly as beloved as she had once been despised for her alliance with the Lannisters. People's memories were short when their bellies were full and a new bride wore a kind smile. Meanwhile, the small council turned its attention toward the final throes of the war. Robb Stark had vanished into the west, some said his forces scattering. Word circulated that certain northern lords were negotiating terms, perhaps to preserve their holdings from further destruction. Lord Bolton and Lord Frey loomed large, though the specifics were muddled in rumor. Tywin planned to mop up what remained of northern resistance, using the combined might of the Lannister and Tyrell armies. Margaery observed these plans from the sidelines, as was her place. Joffrey favored her presence in the council chamber, if only to show off his beautiful queen. She offered no direct military advice. She knew her strengths lay elsewhere, but she gleaned information from each discussion, storing it away for future use. Amid these developments, the matter of Sansa Stark reemerged. Lady Olenna pressed Margaery to secure Sansa's hand for Willis Tyrell, the heir to Highgarden, thus giving the Tyrells a claim on the north. But with the war still in flux and Sansa's position complicated by her father's alleged treason, it was a risky gambit. The Lannisters might see it as a threat to their hold on the north. Yet if Sansa remained in King's Landing under Lannister control, her presence could be used against the Starks. Margaery found herself caught between wanting to protect the girl, whom she had grown fond of, and seizing the opportunity for her house. One evening, as Margaery prepared for bed, she found Sansa waiting outside her chambers, eyes downcast. The young woman looked anxious, as though bracing for yet another disappointment. Margaery dismissed her ladies, ushering Sansa inside. "My lady, are you all right?" Margaery asked gently, guiding her to a chair near the hearth. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows. Sansa perched at the edge, her fingers twisting in her skirts. I heard rumors that your house might wish me to go to Highgarden." She raised her eyes, searching Margaery's face. "Is that true?" Margaery studied the girl's trembling hands, feeling a wave of sympathy. She knelt beside Sansa, placing her own hands atop hers. "House Tyrell has considered it, yes. My grandmother believes that with your claim to the north, you'd be safest away from Lannister schemes. But we must tread carefully. Lord Tywin might see it as an attempt to seize the north." Sansa swallowed. "I'd rather go to Highgarden than remain here. Every day I'm afraid someone will decide I'm no longer necessary, and I don't know what might happen then. Your family has shown me more kindness than I ever had from Joffrey." Margaery's heart clenched. Indeed, Sansa had suffered in the Red Keep. "I wish I could promise you immediate deliverance," Margaery said softly. "But the court is full of dangers. We must move quietly. If we can arrange a formal betrothal to Willis, that would guarantee your protection under House Tyrell. But we need the king's blessing." Sansa's lips trembled. "Why would Joffrey agree? She trailed off, tears threatening. "He hates my family." Margaery rose and retrieved a handkerchief, offering it to Sansa. "Hush, dear. We must think carefully. Joffrey might be appeased if we frame it as an act of generosity, allowing you to find happiness elsewhere rather than forcing you to remain a hostage. He fancies himself gracious in such matters. And if the Tyrells continue to provide for the crown, well, the Lannisters need our gold." Sansa dabbed at her eyes. "I'm so frightened all the time," she whispered. "I just want to be somewhere safe." Margaery placed a hand on her cheek. "I understand. You have my word. I will do what I can." The next few days were spent delicately broaching the topic with Joffrey. Margaery chose a morning when he was in high spirits. He had just received a new shipment of exotic birds from Essos, and was eager to show them off in the royal menagerie. She walked with him through the menagerie, an escort of guards trailing behind, as vibrantly colored parrots squawked from cages. "The Lady Sansa is still at court," Margaery said in a mild tone, "and I've noticed she seems rather lost. Perhaps, as a gesture of kindness, you could grant her leave to wed someone suitable." Joffrey wrinkled his nose. "Why should I care? She's a traitor's daughter." Margaery placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Your Grace, you've already shown your power by not executing her. Keeping her here only gives the Starks a reason to hate you more. But if you allow her to wed a lord loyal to you, someone like Willis Tyrell who has always respected the crown, then you're rid of her without bloodshed. It shows you are merciful and trusting in your own strength." He paused, seeming to mull it over. A bright red parrot screamed overhead, startling him. He glared at the bird before returning his attention to Margaery. "Isn't Willis crippled? Or something of the sort?" Margaery shook her head slightly. "He was injured in a joust some time ago, but by all accounts he is kind and scholarly. The Tyrells will see it as a favor from you, and the rest of the realm will see how benevolent you can be." She lowered her lashes in a show of admiration. "It would be just one more example of your wise rule, uniting the houses." She could almost hear the gears turning in his mind. Joffrey liked the idea of appearing magnanimous without actually sacrificing anything. "Yes," he said at length, "it does remove her from my sight. And if the Tyrells want her so badly, let them have her. It will bind them even closer to us." Margaery stroked his arm. "Precisely, my king." He laughed, clearly buoyed by the image of himself as a gracious monarch. "Very well, I'll announce it soon. Let Sansa Stark be wed to Willis Tyrell. It'll spare me the trouble of looking at her sad face." So it was settled. Joffrey intended to proclaim it at court within days. Margaery quickly sent word to Lady Olenna, who was both pleased and cautious. She reminded Margaery that Tywin might still object, but with Joffrey's support, Tywin would be forced to accept it or risk the king's displeasure. The alliance would be sealed. Highgarden would gain a stake in the north, Sansa would be safer, and Margaery would have a dear friend removed from the Red Keep's dangers. All in all, it was another triumph for House Tyrell's quiet machinations. When the day of the proclamation arrived, the throne room bustled with courtiers. Joffrey sat atop the Iron Throne in full regalia, gold crown glinting in torchlight. Cersei stood at his side, her face inscrutable, while Tyrion and Tywin occupied positions of honor nearby. Margaery stood just behind Joffrey, a picture of demure support, her gown a riot of gold-threaded roses that matched the Tyrell sigil. Sansa was present as well, escorted by a pair of gold cloaks, looking pale and tense. The king clapped for silence. "People of King's Landing," he began, his voice carrying in the vaulted hall, "I have an announcement regarding the traitor's daughter, Sansa Stark." A low hum of curiosity rippled through the assembled lords and ladies. Sansa stood rigid, her eyes downcast. Margaery watched her with a flicker of concern, hoping this moment would at least grant the girl some measure of hope. "In my infinite mercy," Joffrey continued, his chest puffed out, "I have decided not to punish Lady Sansa further for her family's treasons. Instead, I shall allow her to wed a loyal servant of the crown, securing her future away from King's Landing. Lord Willis Tyrell of Highgarden has graciously offered his hand, and I have deemed him worthy. Sansa Stark will be sent to Highgarden to wed under the auspices of House Tyrell's alliance with the Iron Throne." He paused, letting the words sink in. A wave of murmurs arose. Some in the hall cast sly glances at each other. Everyone knew the Tyrells were weaving a tighter net. Lady Olenna, standing among the Reach bannermen, seemed pleased. Tywin's expression was stone, giving nothing away. Cersei wore a brittle smile. Tyrion, for his part, blinked once, then inclined his head with polite acceptance. Joffrey raised his voice again. "Let it be known that this is my gift to her, a demonstration of my magnanimous rule. May she remember that she owes her life to the generosity of her king." The courtiers erupted in cautious applause. Margaery led by example, clapping daintily, her smile warm. Sansa dropped into a deep curtsy, murmuring, "Thank you, Your Grace." Even from her vantage point, Margaery could see the tears shimmering in the girl's eyes. Tears of relief or fear, perhaps a mixture of both. At least Sansa was free from Joffrey's direct cruelty. When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse, Sansa approached Margaery under the watchful gaze of Goldcloaks. The girl's voice shook as she said, "Thank you, Your Grace. I don't know how to repay you." Margaery touched her shoulder lightly. "Live a happy life in Highgarden, my dear. Let that be repayment enough. You'll be among my family, and they will treat you kindly." Sansa nodded, tears escaping despite her attempt to hold composure. Margaery squeezed her hand, then let her depart with the escort. She caught Olenna's eye across the throne room. The older woman gave a subtle nod. Another step was complete in their grand dance. Of course, not all was well within the Red Keep. Cersei's hostility, once a simmering undercurrent, now threatened to boil. She had lost her daughter to Dorne and had no say in her future daughter-in-law Sansa's life. Each day, Margaery felt the Queen Regent's glare intensify. Tyrion, for his part, seemed resigned, as though he was watching from the sidelines, curious to see how events might unfold without personally committing to either side. Lord Tywin continued to plan the final moves of the war, while Joffrey reveled in the adulation he received for his so-called acts of mercy. In private moments, Margaery wondered if King's Landing itself was like a great rose garden, rich with life but riddled with hidden thorns. She was a gardener, carefully pruning and shaping the environment so that the most dangerous predators and the worst pests would remain at bay. Yet she could not forget that even the loveliest garden might harbor serpents. Her marriage to Joffrey remained a precarious pivot point. One misstep, and the illusions of gentility could collapse. Still, House Tyrell had gained much. If the war ended soon, the Tyrells would emerge as the second most powerful family in the realm. Some would say the most powerful, if Joffrey's reign continued to rely on their coin and their harvests. Meanwhile, beyond the city's walls, the Crown's armies marched on. News arrived that Roose Bolton had done the unthinkable and turned on the Starks in a pivotal engagement, and that the Freys had closed their gates against Robb Stark's men. Whispers of a gruesome betrayal at the twins trickled in. The details were murky. Some said the young wolf had been slaughtered, others that he had fled. People spoke of a red wedding, though no one seemed to know the full truth at court just yet. Nonetheless, the outcome was clear. The Northern Rebellion was shattered. By the time Ravens confirmed the rumors, it was official: Robb Stark was dead, and the North lay in disarray. In the throne room, Joffrey crowed with delight at the news, boasting that he had always known the Starks would fall. Tywin remained composed, but there was a certain satisfaction in his bearing. The war was, for all practical purposes, at an end. Now the realm would need to be stitched back together under Lannister Tyrell rule. Margaery saw her father, Mace Tyrell, beam with pride at the prospect of a united kingdom. The Tyrells had bet on the right side, and that bet had paid off in spades. A grand feast was declared to celebrate the defeat of the last major rebel. The feast took place in the Red Keep's Great Hall, banners of the lion, the stag, and the rose all adorning the walls in a lavish display. Servants brought out course after course: roasted boar, succulent capons, trout from the Blackwater, fresh fruits and cheeses from the Reach. Casks of Arbor Gold and Red were tapped, filling goblets without cease. Music filled the air, an almost dizzying medley of harps, lutes, and drums. Courtiers milled about, congratulating one another, forging new alliances in the glow of impending peace. Margaery presided beside Joffrey at the high table, her posture regal, her smile perfectly poised. She spoke softly to him when needed, praising his sagacity, encouraging him to reward loyal houses with titles or lands, and reminding him to maintain a veneer of mercy toward less fortunate houses. She leaned close, letting him feel that the glory was all his, even though the realm knew Tywin had masterminded much of the strategy, and the Tyrell alliance had ensured the Crown's survival at the Blackwater. Nonetheless, appearances mattered more than reality at times. If Joffrey believed himself a triumphant warrior king, so much the better. Throughout the feast, Cersei sat to Joffrey's other side, wearing a forced smile that barely touched her eyes. She drank more than was her custom, occasionally casting sharp glances at Margaery. Tyrion circulated among guests, offering wry jests and trying to moderate the drunken knights who threatened to raise toasts to the Lannisters' victory again and again. Lady Olenna remained in conversation with various lords from the Stormlands and the Crownlands, each drawn to her by her formidable reputation and the knowledge that House Tyrell's goodwill might make or break their fortunes in the coming peace. At one point, Margaery excused herself to refresh. She moved gracefully through the throng of revelers, exchanging polite nods and greetings. She felt the gentle brush of silk and brocade against her arms, heard the low hum of 100 conversations. Finally, she found a moment of quiet near a side corridor, where she could catch her breath. She was not alone for long. Tyrion approached, half a goblet of wine in his hand. His mismatched eyes twinkled in the torchlight. "Your Grace," he greeted with a small bow. "A splendid feast, is it not?" She smiled warmly. "It is indeed, my lord, and a splendid outcome for the realm." Tyrion sipped his wine. "It would seem so. The war ends, the Tyrells stand victorious alongside the Lannisters, and King's Landing is not in flames. Quite the success story." His tone carried a note of irony. Margaery studied him. "You sound almost skeptical." "Not skeptical, merely reflective. Peace is a fleeting thing in Westeros. If it's not the Starks, it will be someone else. And then, of course, there's the matter of your house's increasing, shall we say, horticultural expansions in the capital." She gave him a measured look. "We supply the city with food, we fill the coffers with gold, and we reduce the risk of riots. Is that not beneficial to the crown?" He inclined his head in acknowledgement. "It is, and I, for one, appreciate that. My father likely does too, though he might not openly admit it. I merely observe that King's Landing is now as full of Tyrell men as it is Lannister men, and that the Queen yourself holds more sway over the people's hearts than the King does." She cast a glance at the crowd, ensuring no one lingered too close. "The people need a symbol of hope. Joffrey is not an easy king to love." She paused delicately. "I provide some balance." Tyrion raised his goblet in a mock toast. "Long may you reign, then. If you can keep him from turning the entire city against him, you've done the realm a greater service than most would ever know." He took another sip, then lowered his voice. "Just remember that the game is not over. My sister loathes you for overshadowing her. My father will use you for as long as he finds you useful. And your good brother, the king, well, you know him better than I. Keep your illusions thick, your grace." Margaery let out a soft exhale. "I am aware, but illusions, if tended carefully, can become accepted truth for many. Perhaps that will be enough." Tyrion inclined his head. "Just so." He gave her a small smile, then drifted back into the feast. She returned to the high table, taking her seat beside Joffrey. He glanced at her, a smug smile on his lips. He had enjoyed a raucous toast from a group of knights celebrating the downfall of the northern rebels. Margaery offered him a tender expression, letting her hand rest atop his. In return, he raised his goblet, as though to toast his queen. The crowd cheered, the music played, and the feast continued late into the night. In the weeks that followed, news of the realm's consolidation spread. Rivermen bent the knee or faced retribution. The Tully family was scattered, some imprisoned, some in hiding. Walder Frey and Roose Bolton were named Wardens of the North in some capacity, though the specifics still required hammered-out deals with Tywin. The North remained in disarray, winter creeping ever closer to those cold lands. But for the southern half of Westeros, the war had ended. Dorne stayed quiet, preferring to see how Myrcella's betrothal played out. The Tyrells continued to send out caravans of grain to keep King's Landing sated, for which the people were immensely grateful. Sansa Stark eventually departed for Highgarden under a respectful escort, tears of relief shining in her eyes as she boarded the litter. She embraced Margaery in a final farewell, whispering heartfelt thanks. Margaery returned the embrace, feeling a genuine surge of affection for the girl who had endured so much. When Sansa was gone, Margaery felt lighter, knowing the poor girl would finally be free of Joffrey's presence. Back in the capital, Joffrey grew restless again. Peace brought no battles to conquer, no rebels to punish, though he found ways to amuse himself. He hosted small hunts, demanded new amusements, and occasionally insisted on parading criminals through the streets. Margaery tried to intervene whenever possible, persuading him toward more benign spectacles. Sometimes she succeeded, sometimes not. A cruel streak remained in him, flickering like a blade in the sun. Meanwhile, Lady Olenna deepened her entrenchment at court, forging relationships with various ladies who oversaw trade, crafters, and services within the city. Mace Tyrell worked more closely with Tywin on the small council, though Margaery suspected her father's suggestions frequently originated from her grandmother. The Tyrell presence now resembled a thick vine snaking through the foundations of the Red Keep. One late afternoon, a messenger from the east arrived in the capital bearing curious tidings. Rumors of Daenerys Targaryen across the narrow sea, raising armies and hatching dragons. At first, the small council reacted with incredulity. Dragons? The age of dragons was thought long past. Nonetheless, rumors persisted. Varys took a keen interest, quietly gathering any shred of information. Tyrion relayed the matter in a small council meeting, only to have Joffrey scoff and declare that if some silver-haired girl claimed to be queen, he would have her head. Margaery listened without comment. For now, it was too distant and nebulous to concern them. The realm had just survived one war. The talk of another Targaryen threat seemed the stuff of fireside tales. Yet even if the Targaryens had vanished into legend, unrest was never truly gone from Westeros. Across the narrow sea, the wheels of power might be turning in ways no one in King's Landing yet understood. There were also rumblings from the Iron Islands, where Balon Greyjoy occasionally tested the crown's patience. But with the combined fleets of the Reach and the Westerlands guarding the coasts, the threat from the Ironborn seemed containable. So Margaery remained vigilant. She saw how easily Joffrey fell into sadistic bouts when bored, how Cersei simmered with resentment, how Tywin commanded respect yet courted new conflicts to solidify Lannister power. The Queen of Thorns reminded her granddaughter daily that the capital was a den of foxes, each sniffing for opportunity. And in Margaery's own heart, she felt the weight of what she'd become. A queen who wore a radiant facade, while inwardly harboring the constant tension of holding so many threads in balance. Some nights, she found herself awake at odd hours, pacing the balcony overlooking the city. The flicker of thousands of torches below reminded her of how many lives depended on the choices made in the Red Keep. She would stand there, hair unbound in the night air, letting the breeze carry the scent of the sea, thinking of all she had achieved and all that remained uncertain. Joffrey's reign was only as stable as the alliances propping it up. Perhaps House Tyrell was the most critical of those alliances. The question loomed. Would that be enough to shape the future for the better? Or was she merely forestalling an inevitable collapse? On one such night, she heard footsteps behind her. Turning, she saw Loras once more. He wore the casual garb of a knight off duty, though the white cloak marked him still as a Kingsguard. He offered her a small, weary smile. "I saw the light under your door and worried you might be troubled, sister." She allowed him closer. "Troubled? Perhaps I am. So much has happened, Loras, and yet, I sense the game is not done. We have peace, but I still feel the tension in the air. Cersei's hatred, Joffrey's cruelty, Tywin's ambition, even our own plans with Sansa and Dorne. We keep weaving and weaving." He sighed, leaning on the balcony's stone railing. "I never imagined myself here, serving Joffrey, guarding you from shadows in the night. Sometimes I long for simpler days, jousting for Renly, believing he could be a good king." A faraway look touched his eyes. "But that's gone. We must make the best of what remains." "Yes," Margaery said softly. "That's all we can do. Keep building, keep planting seeds of a better future, in the hope they'll bloom when the storms pass." He touched her hand lightly, If anyone can make that happen, it's you. I see how the people adore you. You give them hope." She met his gaze, gratitude warming her expression. "We do it together, dear brother." The Tyrells stand stronger together. They fell into a reflective silence, watching the city. If a single star flickered in the black sky overhead, it seemed an apt metaphor for how precarious hope could be in a land so often torn by war. Over the ensuing months, the peace took root, though that word in Westeros always carried an asterisk. The northern territories were forcibly subdued. The Freys and Boltons garnered the crown's favor, yet none truly trusted them. Sansa's wedding to Willis was quietly celebrated at Highgarden, with no grand spectacle, but Margaery received letters describing how lovely Sansa looked wearing Tyrell colors. Within King's Landing, trade began to flourish again. Merchants from Essos brought exotic wares, filling the markets with new goods. Many commoners credited the new queen for the city's relative prosperity. Her presence seemed to soften the edges of the monarchy. Joffrey basked in the realm's outward adulation, never suspecting that Margaery's hand lay behind the pageantry. Cersei, for her part, withdrew somewhat from public life, devoting her energies to Myrcella's well-being by Raven, though Myrcella was now mostly in the care of Prince Doran. Rumors said that Oberyn Martell might travel to King's Landing at some point, but no one knew when. Tywin continued shaping the realm to Lannister advantage, distributing offices and titles, collecting favors. Tyrion remained as hand, quietly influencing policy. Varys kept his little birds busy, and Peter Baelish departed for the Vale to pursue an advantageous marriage of his own. The Red Keep teamed with subtle intrigues, but none so overt as to shatter the newly won peace. In that climate of guarded optimism, Margaery devised new ways to cement Tyrell influence. She organized a massive harvest festival in the city, inviting farmers and craftspeople from the Reach to display their produce and wares. She convinced Joffrey to endorse it as a celebration of the realm's bounty, and the festival became a roaring success. Wine flowed freely, dancing erupted in the streets, and for a time, the small folk forgot the horrors of war. In their jubilation, they cried out blessings upon the king and queen. Joffrey took those cheers as his due. Margaery accepted them with humble smiles, fully aware that her generosity was the root cause. But beneath every festival's laughter lay the tension of what might happen if Joffrey's mood soured. As if to remind her of that fact, she caught him late one night in the courtyard, tormenting a servant who had dropped a platter. He had the young man cornered, brandishing a crossbow, a twisted excitement in his eyes. Margaery arrived just in time, gently coaxing Joffrey away, saying he needed not sully his royal hands on such filth, that the man's dismissal would suffice as punishment. Joffrey relented, though not before snarling threats. The servant scurried away, pale as a ghost. Margaery's heart pounded, recalling that this was the monster she had married. Yet her skill in appeasing him was the only thing standing between such cruelty and a city of victims. That same night, once Joffrey had retired, she stood in the darkness of her chambers, her hands trembling. She tried to steady herself, reminding herself that every day she endured him, she saved countless lives from his sadism. If ever there came a time when the realm no longer needed Joffrey, if Tywin fell, if something else changed, Margaery might find a way to shape the monarchy anew. But for now, she was locked in this role. She closed her eyes, inhaled deeply, and let her outward composure settle back into place. Winter approached, creeping down from the north as the harvest months dwindled. The days grew shorter, the winds colder. Yet King's Landing had not seen the true bite of winter in years. The city's inhabitants prayed to the Seven that the winter would be mild. Margaery arranged for increased grain storage, not wanting to risk famine if the harvest shipments slowed. It was a lesson learned from her father. Prepare in times of plenty, lest the times of scarcity catch you unready. Amid these preparations, a faint rumor reached the court. Stannis Baratheon, long quiet on Dragonstone, was stirring once more. Some said he had begun assembling ships and men, backed by foreign gold. Others dismissed it as idle gossip. But even if Stannis threatened from the east, The Tyrell Lannister alliance had grown so dominant that few believed he could pose a genuine challenge. Still, Margaery knew better than to dismiss any Baratheon lightly. Stannis had proven formidable at the Blackwater until the timely arrival of the Tyrell host. She resolved to keep an ear out for more concrete information. One brisk morning, she found Olenna in the gardens, overlooking the last of the roses that still bloomed in the mild climate of the south. The older woman wore a thick shawl and gloves, the cold having little mercy for her bones. Margaery joined her, linking arms as they strolled among flower beds now tinged with a hint of autumn's approach. "How does our dear Joffrey fare today?" Olenna asked, arching a brow. "He's boisterous," Margaery said with a careful sigh. "Still riding the high of victory. He wants more hunts, more extravagances. I redirect him as best I can." Olenna pursed her lips. "You've done well, child. The city thrives under your watch. In the coming months, we'll need to ensure our supplies remain steady. If winter proves harsh, the small folks' gratitude for Tyrell generosity will only deepen." Margaery nodded. "Yes, and at court we must navigate the renewed tensions. Cersei has grown quiet, which I find more concerning than if she were openly hostile. Tywin continues to consolidate power. Tyrion watches everything, as does Varys. But no open threats have arisen yet." A smirk curved Olenna's mouth. "That's how you know something will happen eventually. But we shall handle it. Did I not promise you we'd make you queen and keep you queen?" "You did," Margaery replied, pressing a fond kiss to her grandmother's cheek. "I only hope the next challenge is not too dire." They turned a corner, pausing by a fountain where koi fish swam in lazy circles. Olenna's voice softened. "I know it has not been easy for you, Margaery. I know what Joffrey is and what he is not. I'd have spared you if I could. But we had to secure our family's future." Margaery closed her eyes momentarily. "I understand. Truly I do. The Tyrells have never been so close to true power. If this is the price, I shall pay it." Olenna squeezed her arm, then changed the subject to the approaching feast for the new harvest, offering suggestions about which lords should be seated where. They discussed the intricacies of invitations, ensuring that potential rivals were placed near supporters who might moderate them. Such was the daily labor of life in King's Landing. Careful arrangement of personalities, balancing alliances, ensuring no single threat could break the tenuous peace. As the weeks wore on, Margaery's influence continued to expand beneath the surface. Merchants and guild leaders found themselves thriving under her subtle patronage. The faith of the Seven, long overshadowed by the war, welcomed her charitable donations to the city's septs. In return, the High Septon spoke well of the Queen during sermons, praising her devotion to the gods. Meanwhile, the small folk openly revered her. If a riot threatened, it was quickly quelled by the memory that the Queen herself had fed them in lean times. And yet Margaery knew that as power gathered in her hands, so too did envy and resentment swirl among those who felt overshadowed. Cersei was the most obvious, but others in the royal court might resent the Tyrell ascendancy. One day, those resentments might coalesce into a threat. For now, she and her grandmother kept watch, uprooting any seeds of dissent before they could sprout. The king's new small council, half filled with Tyrell allies, ensured that proposals beneficial to Highgarden passed smoothly. Through it all, the realm itself teetered on the cusp of genuine reconstruction. Roads ravaged by war were repaired, holdfasts rebuilt, villages restored. Lord Tywin made certain the tax collectors filled the royal coffers, while Margaery urged that some portion of the gold be spent visibly improving the capital. Joffrey took the credit, of course, cutting ribbons on new trade halls or opening renovated marketplaces. It did not matter who accepted the accolades, so long as the city thrived, and so long as House Tyrell reaped the intangible rewards of gratitude. Winter, however, marched closer with each passing day. Snows began to fall in the northern reaches, drifting steadily down through the neck. The Vale grew cold, the riverlands frosted. King's Landing itself still mostly saw rain, but cold winds whipped up from the sea. Word came that the lords of Winterfell, whoever claimed that seat now, struggled to keep order among the surviving northern houses. Sansa, nestled in the warmth of Highgarden, reportedly wrote letters urging mercy for her people. On a stormy night, thunder rolling over Blackwater Bay, Margaery gazed out from a balcony, her cloak pulled tight against the wind. Lightning illuminated the ships anchored near the city, a combined presence of royal galleys and a handful of Tyrell vessels, their sails furled. She thought of what it meant for winter to arrive in the capital, with less farmland to feed the populace if war had ravaged the surrounding countryside too extensively. She thought of how the Tyrell shipments might slow if roads were iced or if the harvest was meager next year. She wondered, fleetingly, if the entire realm might starve if the climate turned truly harsh. And then she thought of Joffrey, warm in his chambers, likely bored, perhaps waiting to torment someone or demand a new game. The image brought a weariness to her, a quiet longing for a different life. If only she could have wed someone like Renly, a man with a gentler soul. But that path was gone. She was queen now, and she would wear the crown for as long as it served the Tyrell cause, and possibly even beyond if fortune favored her. She closed her eyes, letting the thunder rattle the stones beneath her feet. This was her reality, and she would shape it with all the grace and cunning she possessed. Dawn broke, and with it, fresh tidings. A raven arrived bearing news that Balon Greyjoy had died in the Iron Islands under suspicious circumstances. Some rumored a storm had blown him off a bridge, others whispered darker happenings. The Iron Islands soon erupted into chaos as multiple claimants vied for the Seastone chair. While that might have threatened the crown under normal circumstances, Tywin and Mace Tyrell viewed it as an opportunity. A divided Iron Islands would pose no unified threat. Indeed, perhaps the crown could bring them to heel while they fought amongst themselves. Yet another piece of the puzzle. Margaery listened to the small council's discussion, offering a smile whenever the men praised the possibility of an easy subjugation of the Ironborn. She kept her own counsel, suspecting the Ironborn might prove trickier than they believed. Still, if they were weakened, the Tyrell and Lannister navies could blockade them at will. Every new conflict seemed to bring an advantage, or at least an angle, for House Tyrell. Each season that passed saw Margaery's position more firmly entrenched. The small folk called her the White Rose or the People's Queen, lauding her kindness. Joffrey, in turn, soaked up the adulation he believed was his by right, never grasping how much of it was orchestrated by Margaery's machinations. He remained the volatile figurehead, unpredictable yet essential to maintaining the alliance with the Lannisters. Tywin occasionally observed Margaery with a calculating gaze. He must have recognized how expertly she handled Joffrey, how the city's love for her overshadowed any fear they might have for the king. But so long as Tywin believed that served House Lannister's ends, he did not interfere. Cersei simmered, but found herself politically outmaneuvered at every turn. She had lost her daughter to Dorne, her power at court diminished by Margaery's popularity and Olenna's cunning. On rare occasions, she would lash out verbally, or her eyes would flash with venom when Margaery received praise. Yet Cersei could not directly challenge her without risking Joffrey's wrath or Tywin's. So the tension stayed coiled, a viper in the grass. On a crisp evening, Margaery walked the Red Keep's walls, gazing at the city below, the rooftops blanketed in a thin mist. Her cloak trailed over the stone battlements, and she kept her arms wrapped around herself for warmth. She paused at a spot overlooking the Blackwater. This was the vantage point from which Stannis' fleet had once been seen in the distance, bearing down on the city. A lifetime ago or so it seemed. Now the water was calm, reflecting starlight. She heard a faint footstep behind her. Turning, she found Joffrey approaching. He wore a fur-lined cloak, the crown perched on his golden hair. She dipped a short, respectful curtsy, though she was queen, and he was her husband. "What are you doing here alone?" he asked, eyes scanning the night. "Just breathing in the air," she answered softly. "Thinking of how far we've come since the war." His mouth quirked. "Yes, the war. I wish I'd been able to kill Stannis myself. He should thank the gods he fled. Someday I may still end him." She laid a gentle hand on his arm, feeling him tense at the contact. "You united the realm, Joffrey. No one doubts that now. Your victory is known across the narrow sea." He relaxed slightly, gazing at her face. "You always know what to say." He leaned in, pressing a possessive kiss to her lips. She forced herself to respond just enough to maintain the illusion of wifely devotion, though her heart pounded for other reasons. When he drew back, he stared at her with an intensity that flickered with desire and menace in equal measure. "Come," he said, tugging her hand. "It's cold. We should return inside." She nodded, allowing him to lead her along the walkway. Beneath the starry sky, they walked back into the Red Keep's corridors. She cast one last look at the city before the torchlit hallway enclosed them. The capital was her stage, and as queen, she had played her part to perfection so far. She prayed that her roses would continue to bloom despite winter's approach, that House Tyrell's cunning would outlast any threat on the horizon, be it from the Iron Islands, the Targaryens, or even within these very walls. Time would tell. Yet for now, as the castle's gates locked behind them, Margaery Margaery Baratheon, walked arm in arm with her king, a gentle smile on her lips, fully aware that the power she held lay in the hearts of the people and in the quiet manipulations that underpinned Joffrey's throne. Hers was a garden carefully cultivated, each blossom a symbol of House Tyrell's ascendance. And no matter the storm clouds gathering beyond the horizon, she would tend that garden with unwavering resolve, determined to see it flourish in a realm all too often scorched by war.